The final president we're going to look at for this time period is Ronald Reagan. He was a Republican who was elected in 1980, served 2 terms, famous for being a former governor of California, a former movie star whose best known movie was called Bedtime for Bonzo, where he starred with a chimp, and he had been the president of the Screen Actors Guild and an avowed anti-communist back in the 1940s and 50s. So his election in 1940 really brought about this new conservative era. He easily defeated Carter, again with his popular promise to lower taxes and increase spending. And the spending, as he saw it, should be used for the right things, which was the military. Abortion had been declared legal in 1973 thanks to Roe versus Wade, and President Reagan was pro-life, and his goal was to ban abortion. And this wedded many conservatives to his side, which continues today with the evangelicals movement in the United States, the fundamentalist Christians who are aligned with the Republicans. The Republicans won control of the Senate, so it was easy for Reagan to push through any legislation. The picture is him with his wife, Nancy, who was a rather controversial figure. She spent lavishly in the White House, buying all new kinds of china, liked to wear red, and often consulted her astrologist and told Ronald Reagan that he should make decisions based on his astrological signs. So his inaugural address became famous, and his goal was to restore Americans' confidence, and said that it's no longer government's job to come to the rescue, that people should be self-reliant and independent, which kind of sounds like Herbert Hoover back in 1928. So his 2 terms epitomize sort of the decadence and good economy of the 1980s. So as we know, the economy hadn't been too good under Carter, and his approach was twofold. He said, if we raise the interest rates, it would cut down on the amount of money in circulation. And here is a very controversial method that he tried, was known as trickle down or supply side. If people's taxes are cut, they will then have more money to spend more. If corporations' taxes are cut, they can invest more, which would create more jobs, more goods produced, and consumers would now be able to afford goods with lower taxes. And I wrote there a question, does it work? Has it been tried recently? The answer is yes. One of the very first things President Trump did after his inauguration was push through a tax cut to the highest earners, or the job creators, as he called them, in hopes that it would trickle down to the workers. This has proven to not necessarily be the case, however, because all it took was the pandemic to see that no matter how good the stock market is, people who did not have a paycheck could barely pay their rent the next week. So a strong stock market doesn't always equal a strong economy for working people. But this trickle-down economics was known as Reaganomics, and today it is widely preached by many conservatives. And this tax cut was 25%, which is quite a bit, and the wealthy people and upper middle class people really, really benefited during the 1980s. Because the government was collecting fewer taxes, though, you have to cut, and he cut many welfare programs. He tried to balance the budget, but of course, we relied again on deficit spending, which is spending money that you don't have, and in particular, money during the 1980s was spent to build up defense. Under Reagan, we began to see an acceleration of taking the federal government oversight away from the economy, and in particular from things like the FCC, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. This is something that President Trump is practicing too, particularly with the environment, believing if there are fewer regulations, the advantage will go to the consumer. And in some ways, in the early 80s, as they took away regulations over the airlines, new companies created, new jobs, lower prices, etc. But as the EPA eased up, we saw more companies take over public land for drilling, mining and logging, which, yes, helps the economy, but it's been a disaster for the environment. By 1984, Reagan faced his second election, and the U.S. was well on its way to economic recovery. Unemployment was at its lowest rate. There were 5 million new businesses, 20 million new jobs, and the average family, their income rose 15%, which is really, really good. So look at the map. His reelection was unbelievable. He had 97.6% of the electoral vote with his vice president, and they ran against Mondale and Ferraro. And Geraldine Ferraro was the first presidential or vice presidential running mate candidate for a major party, and that was back in 1984. And 4 years ago, of course, Hillary Clinton ran for the presidency as a Democrat, but we have yet to have a female president or vice president. So along with the conservative era and the conservative values that many Americans espoused, President Reagan was able to put 3 justices on the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor, pictured there, she's the first woman, William Rehnquist, and Antonin Scalia. And Scalia just died a few years ago and was replaced by, President Trump was able to put 2 conservatives on the Supreme Court. Foreign policy-wise, Reagan projected an air of strength, and unlike the domino theory or containment, he openly challenged the Soviet Union, and he put an end to détente. So we got rid of the policies under Eisenhower, under Kennedy, under Johnson, under Nixon, and called the Soviet Union an evil empire and said that the U.S. must defeat. And this idea appealed to many people. He advocated peace through strength and started the biggest military buildup in history. In order to do that, however, America's debt grew from $80 billion to over $200 billion. But in effect, this helped end the Cold War because our military and nuclear stockpile were added to so much, so vast, that the Soviet Union could not possibly keep up. So the other part of his doctrine, the Reagan doctrine, was supporting militants fighting against communist or any pro-Soviet governments. For example, we know that the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and they fought against guerrillas known as the Mujahideen, and the United States sent aid to help defeat the Soviets. And the irony, of course, is the Mujahideen turns into Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So initially we're supporting them against the Soviets, and eventually they turn against us as terrorists. So behind the scenes, we see a lot of covert operations. The CIA funded the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, and these holy warriors, as we said, conflicted with other troops in Afghanistan. And in a sense, Reagan is given credit, although not a good credit, for helping create the Taliban and, of course, Al-Qaeda, as I just said. We also had anti-Soviet efforts in Latin America, and Reagan secretly, notice the word again, secretly sided with anti-communist guerrillas in the country of Nicaragua, and these revolutionaries were known as Contras. And Contras were fighting the Sandinistas, who were the socialist group funded by Cuba and the Soviet Union. And Congress discovered that Reagan had been secretly funding and put an end to this. So, however, there was a secret deal with Iran. Even though Congress had banned aiding rebels in Nicaragua, rebels had secretly negotiated with Iran, sold them weapons in exchange for getting American hostages released, and then used these profits to fund the Contras. So you don't need to know the details, but just know that it was a covert operation, illegal, scandalous, and Reagan denied knowledge of how the money went to the Contras, but this did damage his reputation. One of the main characters out of this was Marine Colonel Oliver North, who testified before Congress, and he worked with the CIA and admitted to secret deals and backdoor deals to cover up this dealing with Iran. But Reagan, again, said he didn't know anything about it, and many people justified it in the names of getting rid of communism in Nicaragua. Many Americans began to feel that the rapid development of nuclear weapons, the rapid military buildup in Western Europe was dangerous. And eventually there were talks with the Soviets about each side removing theirs, or sort of reducing theirs. And there was a plan to have strategic arms reduction talks, but the Soviets refused to meet. So again, Reagan's idea of a buildup, he felt that this was a moral decision, and deterrence was the theory that each side would be too scared to use them. But he didn't like the idea of people feeling that the only way there was peace was the reliance on threats to kill millions of people. So he asked Congress to build defensive weapons, which were nicknamed Star Wars, and the Strategic Defense Initiative was created to detect incoming missiles and shoot them down. And billions of dollars went towards this. Again, borrowed money and deficit spending. And we began to see the American debt go through the roof. Here's an idea of Star Wars, the strategic, as it was imagined, strategic defense systems. Okay. So also at the same time, even though this military buildup was continuing against the Soviet Union, things were happening directly in the USSR, and we saw a new Prime Minister, Mikhail Gorbachev, who felt the United States needed reforms, in particular economic reforms. And this word perestroika is a Russian word to focus on improving the Russian economy. Well, if the Soviets were putting all their money into the Russian economy, they couldn't afford the new arms race with the United States. And we have meetings between Reagan and the Gorbachev, including some at the White House. And at first, both sides were somewhat unwilling to budge. So Reagan, believing he had the upper hand, made a public order to tear down the Berlin Wall. And that's one of his most famous lines. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. There's a little video clip there that you can watch. I've posted in Google Classroom. And eventually, a treaty was signed between the United States and the Soviet Union known as the INF, which helped to reduce intermediate-range nuclear forces. This willingness to change in the Soviet Union eventually led Gorbachev to create further reforms, including somewhat of a free market capitalist economy, cutting down on military spending, and this ultimately led to the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. In November of 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down, and the Soviet Union's 15 republics gained their independence. And that's how we ended up with countries like Ukraine and Turkestan and Uzbekistan and all these former Soviet republics, which are now independent. So 31 years ago, we see the destruction of the Soviet Union, and for a while, the Cold War ends with maybe grudging respect between the United States and the Soviet Union. Today, however, with Putin in charge, a former high-ranking Politburo member in communist Soviet Union and a member of the KGB, he is ramping up antagonism against the United States. And of course, our intelligence sources say that the Soviet Union directly got involved in the American election in 2016. So today our relationships with Russia are pretty bad. But 1989, 1991 was an era where we really felt for the first time that this nuclear proliferation wasn't hanging over our head. And it was a new period of openness between the Soviet Union and the United States. Once the Berlin Wall came down, East Germany and West Germany reunited, and today they remain a united country and one of our greatest allies in Western Europe.